Ladies and gentlemen and honoured guests, wherever you might be today, good afternoon, good evening and good morning, and above all, welcome. My name is Bruce Hemmingson and I will be your moderator for today's lecture presentation, which discusses Christianity and the origin of Scotch whisky in the Catholic Church. Today's presentation, entitled Christianity and the Origin of Whisky, is brought to you by the APAVM, where we enjoy the tireless support, dedication, and enthusiasm of our chairman, Mr. Ben Chang, and his wife, Kim. So, in advance, let me express our appreciation to both Ben and Kim for making this wonderful event possible for us all. For a moment now, let's all enjoy a brief prelude video entitled The History of Scotch Whisky.
They adored back in 1494. 8 bowls of malt for Friar John Core. Scottish, Irish, who was first, matters not, they quench their thirst. Ushgabia, the water of life. Growing barley since they're born, burning peat to keep warm. Whiskey soon kicked up a storm and business came along. Robert Stein, then coffee stills, cheap grain whiskey to distill. Smugglers skipping tax bills and things are going strong. We didn't start the fire, always burning since the peat was turning. We didn't start the fire. The Scots who loved whiskey started an industry. Highlands, lowlands, different tax. Excise men on the attack. The Excise Act came along in 1823. Who'd have thought a tasty drop could come out of a copper pot? And Lambert proudly claimed its spot by prefacing with thee. The Lochra killed the vines in France, blenders did a happy dance. Johnny Walker did it right, Buchanan too with black and white. Peter Mackie, Douglas Haig, Tommy Dewar, Baron's maid. Alfred Barnard wrote his book, the Patterson Brothers, Jalbers Crooks. He didn't start the fire, the early whiskey blend set the modern trends. We didn't start the fire, it started throttling like a calf-strength bottling. Business rose, business fell, some went and formed the DCL. Campbelltown dropped off the shelf, then Scotia's owner drowned himself. Prohibition, world wars, shook the game right to the core. Things go from boom to bust, who in whiskey can you trust? From the mid-20th century, distillers changed technology. Shell and tube condensers, washbacks made of stainless steel. Malting's floor seem now a sin, cheaper to buy your malt needs air. Direct heating phased out, steam heating all about. Single malt sold quietly, that is till 1963. Glenfiddich did it properly and slowly changed the tune. New distilleries being built, Seagram gave it quite a tilt. Barrels, hogshead, sherry bus, no one saw the coming cuts. We didn't start the fire, there was no one thinking that the ship was sinking. Production was getting higher, but in 83 they were lost at sea. 1980s things were rash, distilleries closed in massive crash. Things got hot, too much stock, giving us the whiskey lot. The classic malts came to the fore, Glenkinchie, Oban, Cragganmore, Lagavulin and Talisker, and don't forget Dalwhinnie. Douglas Lang, signatory, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Cadenhead, Gordon MacPhail, independence rarely fail. Michael Jackson's Whiskey Guide, expos just like Whiskey Live. Whiskey clubs begin to thrive, the industry is back in boom. Sherry casks now very rare, prices go up everywhere. Salford casks cannot be purged, fake Macallan's now emerge. Older whiskey price tags sing, NAS is now a thing. Auction prices go sky high, the cost of whiskey makes you cry. We didn't start the fire, life is grand when you have a dram. We didn't start the fire, barley, yeast and water, you know it's good for ya. We didn't start the fire, yet the smoke on Isla keeps on getting higher. We didn't start the fire, hope you like this tune and visit Scotland soon.
Christianity and the origin of whisky, at first blush, seem to be unlikely companions, but this, my friends, is a tale that spans several centuries of Scottish history. In today's lecture, we will be embarking upon a thought-provoking journey into the amazing history of Scottish whisky and how its somewhat colourful association with Christianity came to occur. Scotch whisky, or the water of life, has its origins embedded in the history of Scottish Christianity, the Christian monarchy, Scottish nobility, some ingenious monks, and monasticism as a whole. Whisky, and for that matter, a good Scotch whisky, is prized by royalty, nobility, priests, and lay people alike, and is lauded as a mark of both hospitality and faith, as well as being utilised widely for its medicinal purposes under the Latin naming of Spiritus Frumentae, or spirit of the grain. Scotch whisky finds its heritage in the early saints, medieval kings, monasteries, and monastic orders, including the Benedictine monks of St. Tyrone. During the 1400s, the Catholic religion became firmly established in Scotland for nearly a millennium, until the Catholic Church was outlawed following the Scottish Reformation in 1560. Despite this setback, the priesthood survived in Scotland in part due to the role played by whisky. In this regard, the story of Cardew, Scotland's saintly distillery, is one which champions St. Michael's motto of hospitality. Without doubt, the role of whisky is inextricably linked to the Catholic faith, and its popularity remains enshrined in modernity to this very day. After all, who doesn't enjoy a good Scotch on a cold winter's night? So, without further delay, allow me now to welcome and introduce our esteemed and highly knowledgeable presenter, Robert Bob Ross Allan. So Bob to his friends. Bob Allan is an expert whisky quality assurer, including nosing and verifying whisky against product standards at Diageo distilleries, where he has managed Johnnie Walker production lines, including Dimple, J&B, Bell's, and Cardew whisky brand. Bob is currently the managing director of both the Spirit of Kilmarnock and the Spirit of Ayrshire companies, creating the first ever distillery in Kilmarnock, distilling whisky and gin. Bob is currently an active member of the Scottish Malt Whisky Society and General Counsel of the University of St Andrews, and is an honorary lifetime member of the Student Association of the University of St Andrews, the National Trust for Scotland, and has also served on the board of the Chartered Management Institute Ayrshire branch. So from a very chilly Kilmarnock, where I think it's 1 degree at the moment, please now welcome Bob Allan to the microphone. Bob, over to you.
So Christianity and the origins of whisky, the water of life, and how we enjoy the modern whisky and where it came from. So first we're going to start with 640 AD. Scotland, not a kingdom as yet, not Christian, but the shoots were appearing. This is the 4 parts of the early Scotland. This is Pictland in the north. These were the people that resisted Hadrian and Emperor Augustus. And the reason for building a wall across this part of Scotland called Hadrian's Wall to keep these Picts out of the Roman Empire. This orange area is where the Scots came from, a country called Dalriada, which stretched down to Ireland down here in the basically in the west. Then there was another country called Strathclyde, which was the remnants of the ancient Britain's kingdom. And then finally, Northumbria, which is an early Saxon kingdom and one of the kingdoms to try and resist the Norman conquest in 1066. All of these played a part in the forming of what was to be Scotland. But as I say, not Christian yet, mainly pagan, mainly a missionary country. Which came first, whisky or Catholicism? Well, the truth is, early Christians came far before whisky was distilled in Scotland. First, we had St. Rule of Patras, who brought the relics of St. Andrews from Greece to St. Andrews in Fife, around about 347 AD. He was meant to have seen a vision of angels and that told him to sail to the westernmost tip of the world to deliver St. Andrews' relics. And he did. And this is the remains of St. Andrews Cathedral, where until the early 1500s, St. Andrews relics were interred in the university town of St Andrews. St Ninian was one of the first bishops of Scotland. He was the Bishop of Galloway. He was parents were Catholics, and they sent him to Rome, and he came back and he was made one of the first bishops here in St Whithorn in Galloway. This is an example of an early Scottish church, and this was the church that the first bishop would have actually preached in. Then we have St Columba in Iona. This is the Abbey in Iona, which is famous for its mead. It's round about the 1100s this particular building was built, so a while after St Columba. But St Columba built it here on an island to keep it safe from the then Vikings who used to go around raiding Christian settlements, mainly for their silver and reliquaries. Then we have St Mungo, round about 518 to 643 AD, and he's famous for having founded Glasgow Cathedral. Glasgow Cathedral is unusual in Scotland that it's survived since 1100, and this is it lit up at night, as you can see it now. So not the early part of the foundation when St Mungo was interred in it, but St Mungo is the patron saint of Glasgow, and as I say, the oldest cathedral, very beautiful cathedral in the city of Glasgow. Scotland started to amalgamate in 840 AD. This first king recognised as the King of Scotland was Kenneth I. He married, and when he married, he managed to amalgamate the Pictland and Dalriada. And then by conquest, he conquered Strathclyde and a section of what was Northumbria. He also was there when he saw St Andrew's cross in the sky, and from that he promised that that flag would be forever. The St Andrew's cross would be forever Scotland's flag, and it is to this day. We now cut to David I, 1124 to 1159 AD. This is when Christianity started to take off, and also the foundations, which was the most important factor in bringing whisky to Scotland. His mother had built two monasteries, which are the yellow and orange arrows that you can see. She had been a Saxon princess and actually was an heir to the English throne when the Normans had conquered it. On this basis, David I, who was her sixth son, brought in and built another 14 new monasteries. Very important because he could see the advantage of improving the land, education, and the offer of standardizing religion across the country. This is David I. He was the sixth son of St Margaret, as she was known, St Margaret of Scotland, his mother, the family Canmore. He was the third king of the family Canmore. And in bringing the monks brought, as we say, here they are, the Benedictine monks, education, science, and also improvement to the land. Very important, because monasteries to survive need to have a tithe, and the tithe is a tenth of the crop from their lands that they own. They didn't run the farms. Technically, they owned them under the crown, and they would collect 1/10 of the crop. And to do that, they would improve the land. And a big part of what they did was improve barley production. Barley production led to beer, and beer, of course, is the precursor to whisky. They also knew about distilling spirits in small quantities, but no whisky at this time. 1141, there's no record of any whisky being distilled in Scotland, although they did know about medicinal spirits. We now come to Raymond of Lull. He is the first scholar to be recorded writing and standardizing distillation. He's a Spanish saint. He saw God in a vision and became a monk, one of the Benedictine order. And he wrote a thesis on why people should become Christians based on maths, but he also recorded carefully how to standardize distillation so that you could manufacture a good, pure spirit. There's a page from 14th century book, actually from Germany, to show how important Saint Ramon was. you can see that this is the 14th century, nearly a century after he lived, imagining what it was like to listen to his lectures on maths and science. As I say, very important man, and his books were recorded and duplicated across the monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines. We get the first record in 1405 of whisky. Actually, an Irish chieftain dying of drinking too much whisky at Christmas, which is an unfortunate story, but recorded nonetheless. This is very typical of the time. Any whisky that was produced would have been for noblemen, high-born people, and probably for the monastic orders. The records in Scotland indicate that few farms were producing enough beer to have a surplus of beer, so it was unlikely any farmers were distilling, although chieftains who could collect tithes, as did the monasteries, would be able to brew and distill. We do know Edinburgh Distillery, known as Glen Skeens, was started in 1430, again connected to a monastic order. Here we have Dr. Jackson Armstrong from the Aberdeen project, and they found in the records in 1505 the first records of apparatus recorded in Scotland, and that was in Aberdeen, shortly after the foundation of Aberdeen University, founded by papal bull, again run by priests and monks, and not long after the foundation of St. Macher's Cathedral came to Aberdeen. This is a picture of St. Macher's Cathedral, built in 1400. The interesting thing is this building survived the Reformation. You can see Roman pillars here, so it's a very, very old cathedral. So Roman style as opposed to the flying buttress style of France. And you can see it's got an old wooden ceiling. Unusual, survived the Reformation, and you can see it's also got the end where the high altar would be, which again is unusual for a Scottish post-Reformation cathedral. We now cut to Lindores Abbey, where the first record in any Scottish records in 1495 was a Friar John Corr was given malt enough to make 1,500 bottles of whisky for King James IV. He is reckoned to be a Renaissance king, probably one of the richest kings that Scotland ever had in terms of the kingdom by itself. And here you've got a picture of what distillation would have looked like in 1495. You can see these round stills, and this is a fire underneath, and they were pouring whisky into small bottles. The two gentlemen here that are looking quite excited, what appears to be a hole in the ground, this is actually the remnants of one of these stills. You can see the round base and the black char where they used to put the coal in. On top of that, there would have been a copper still. So that's the copper stills around about 1495. And this is Lindores Abbey, which unfortunately was destroyed during the Reformation. But there is now a modern distillery drawing water from the original source waters of Lindores Abbey. Reformation, 1530. Henry VIII split with Rome. James IV, who we just heard about, went to war with who was his nephew, and his nephew, unfortunately, the King James IV of Scotland died in the war, and his son, King James V, came to follow Henry VIII and split up, and effectively the Reformation ended the abbeys and the monasteries across Scotland. Hundreds of monks were then put into the community. Many were made to marry, and when they married into agricultural families that tried to continue Catholicism, particularly in the northern parts of Scotland. And the result of that was you got people who knew about brewing and distilling in the same family. And that meant the whisky, for the first time, moved into the Scottish community. People learnt how to distill in farmhouses. This is the ruin of Melrose Abbey. It was one of the biggest abbeys in Scotland. 200 to 300 monks were put out into the community when the abbey was closed and the land handed over to the crown. During the Reformation, images of saints were destroyed, particularly saints that were people, because it was seen to be idolatry by what was the Protestant faith. Glasgow and Linlithgow were unusual. Glasgow Cathedral, the people of the town, the city turned out to defend the cathedral. That's why it's in such good order today. And here you can actually see what were the tradespeople of the town turning out to defend the cathedral from what we can imagine is the Presbyterian or Protestant people that are destroying Christian artifacts. Linlithgow was unusual in that it was a royal chapel. This is it today. And also the town saint was St. Michael, an archangel. This caused a problem in that archangels are biblical. So in other words, they actually are part of the heavenly host. So St. Michael was retained and his statue wasn't destroyed. And in fact, in 1720, in the middle of what was the Catholic Jacobite Wars, the people of Linlithgow raised another statue to St. Michael in the middle of the town. And here you can see his motto, St. Michael's kind to strangers. As I say, very unusual, 1720, to find any Scottish town raising statue to a saint, but St. Michael, being an archangel, seems to have been exempted and was undeniably a biblical character. This is the inside of the Royal Cathedral, the Royal Chapel. It's still a Royal Chapel today. And you can see it's unusual because you can still see there's a high altar. And this is unusual for a Presbyterian church. St. Michael's an unusual in that there's two St. Michael's, a Roman Catholic St. Michael's and the Royal Chapel in the same town. So St. Michael, very popular saint and important in Scottish history. We now come to the quaich. The quaich is used as a drinking cup for honoured guests and noblemen originally. And people would serve whisky in this and they would give gifts of these at baptisms and weddings. We know that King James VI, who went on to be King James I of the United Kingdom, must have been drinking whisky because he gave Queen Anne of Denmark, his future queen, a wedding gift of a quaich in 1589. You only gave these if your intention was to drink whisky from them in Scotland. 1603, James VI became the first Protestant king of the United Kingdom, as it is now. And he and the royal family are directly descended from King James VI. The Stuart monarchy, his grandson, James VII and II, converted back to Catholicism. Being the United Kingdom, and that meant there was a problem for Parliament in England, where the monarch was nominally the head of the Anglican Church. So when he died in 1714, here's his son, James III, who was also raised as a Catholic, was deposed in favour of his Protestant sister, Queen Anne. Queen Anne was a staunch Protestant, and rather than see her brother succeed to the throne, left her crown to William of Orange, a cousin from Holland. And that is one of the families that the current royal family is descended from, William of Orange, a Dutch prince. All three of them have whiskies named after them. And it was at one point, you could actually tell whether somebody was of the Presbyterian, Anglican, or Catholic persuasion by which whisky they drank, named after queens and kings. Catholicism was effectively outlawed in 1715, but Scotland, the area that's in yellow here, Catholicism still survived, and in 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the son of James III, led an army and landed from France and marched on Oxford. Here he is. This is Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he was called. He was defeated at Culloden, and in the Battle of Culloden, whisky was used for the first time in the last rites. It's recorded Lord Allan was given the last rites using whisky and an oat cake. Culloden is approximately here. The prince was defeated, imprisoned, escaped to France. But he did leave the legacy of Drambuie. Drambuie was left as a whisky liqueur, and it was gifted to one of his loyal families that had protected him. Today, it's still made in Scotland, and the recipe is a secret known to only 3 people, kept in the Bank of Scotland's vaults. They make a batch of it once a year, which is then added to whisky and is the world famous Drambuie. Direct legacy of Bonnie Prince Charlie. That's the claim of the family that were given the gift. Catholicism was suppressed following 1715, yet survived thanks to whisky. In the yellow area, the Scots at the top of the Scottish Whisky Road, the farmers used to protect the last remaining training place for priests in Scotland. So 1717 to 1799, the College of Scotland was the only place, in fact, in the United Kingdom, that was able to train priests. What would happen was when Presbyterian and Protestant troops used to come up the valley, the Catholic whisky distilling farmers would warn the priests, and the priests would disperse into the hills, and that meant that the priests were never captured. Apparently there was 8 raids, not one priest was ever captured, and that's how the priesthood and Catholicism survived in Scotland for nearly 80 years. In 1794, the act that made Catholicism illegal was abolished, but few distilleries were named around saints or tried to avoid association with Catholicism through naming saints. But Macallan, unusually, which is made here in the Duke of Gordon's lands, very close to where Scotland College is, was different. It was named after the Gaelic name of Mag and Allan, which is fertile land near St. Fillan's. St. Fillan's was a Catholic church on the Duke of Gordon's land. The Duke of Gordon was unusual. He was a Catholic who had said that he would side with the Hanoverians, who were the Protestant monarchy. And because of that, he was allowed to keep his lands, and he was able to protect Catholicism and Catholics on his lands. Here it is, the bottle of Macallan, effectively named after a saint. So unusual. It's not a name, it's actually fertile land of St. Fillan. Now we cut to Cardew. Cardew is one of the distilleries in the Catholic Speyside area. And in 1772, Parliament had passed acts which effectively meant that to distill, you had to take up a license. This was not the done thing in Catholic Speyside. And John Cumming owned the farm on which Cardew Distillery was founded. And his wife, Helen, was one of the Catholic resistance. And what she used to do when she saw troops coming to try and capture people's illegal stills, she would raise a flag. And I believe tonight you're going to drink Cardew. And hopefully if you get to see the label on the bottle, you'll see Helen raising the flag. And what used to happen when she raised the flag, that all the distillers used to hide their stills. And this used to become such a nuisance that eventually the troops cut a deal with Helen that if she was able to hand over old distillery bits, they would go away satisfied. So what she used to do in a place called the Black Rock, she used to lead the troops there. They would miraculously find old distilling parts. She would get paid, and then she would split the money, and people would buy new parts for the stills. So everybody went home happy. The people on the Speyside got their distillery renewed. The troops got some evidence they'd captured an illegal still, and they were seen to be doing their job. When she retired, Helen and John had become a legal still, and they sold the Cardew Distillery to the Johnnie Walker's Company. And Johnnie Walker's Cardew is one of the main whisky in the famous Johnnie Walker's whisky today. But its origins lie in these Catholic Cardew distillery as it was way back in 1813. Longevity in Scotch whisky. There's lots of stories in Scotland about drinking in moderation, giving you a long life. This is the amazing Grace Jones. She died in 2019, aged 112. And she claimed that regular church attendance and a daily dram was the foundation of longevity. Here in front of her, a rather famous company, the famous Grouse, were able to effectively do this very nice picture of her with a litre of famous Grouse. And other whiskies are available, but this is one of the nice stories. And my own family has a story of people having extra long life because they drank a dram of whiskey. Allegedly, one of our relatives lived to be 121. Not sure if that's actually true, but that's what the Scotch records show. John Paul II, he was the first Pope to visit the United Kingdom, and Scottish people being Scottish and the history of Scotch whisky, it was deemed appropriate to give the Pope 9 gallons of whisky in a barrel called a firkin. And here he is. This is at Glasgow. And this is a picture of the famous Mass in Glasgow Park. And John Paul II, very much adored as a modern Pope. This is the picture of the late Elizabeth II. The United Kingdom's monarchs are the head of the Anglican Church. And here they are visiting the Pope, and with Prince Philip and herself giving the Pope a bottle of whisky as a gift. So this has come full circle. Here we have the head of the Anglican Church and the head of the Catholic Church, the two biggest Christian churches in the world. And one is exchanging perhaps the most significant Christian gift of all, the waters of life. The Pope is actually recorded as saying the whisky was indeed the water of life. And that's a quote in getting a gift of a bottle of whisky from the Scotch College in Rome. So a final piece of humour. Lord, give me coffee to change the things I can change, and whisky to accept the ones I cannot. And that's it. Thank you very much. Over to the questions.
So Bob, thank you very much for what has been an amazing and thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure the audience has learned a great deal more about Scotch whisky and its close association with the Catholic Church across the centuries. Already, I think you've spiked quite a lot of interest. So we have a number of questions from our audience regarding your talk. So I'm going to open up the floor, and actually I'm in control of one of the questions. I know you'll be able to answer this with ease. From Father Michael, who's in Ireland, he would, and this is a question in 3 parts. He'd like to know, what is the difference between Scottish and Irish whisky? And then to add to that, then what is the difference between bourbon or American whisky, and then also, that's from Ben Chang, and then also Japanese whisky compared with Scottish whisky from Sharon Tay.
Okay, well, Scottish to Irish whisky. Scottish whisky is usually double distilled. And I know that in Ireland, there is a tradition of triple distilling. So triple distilling technically takes out more of the long chains in the whisky. And that means that when you get an Irish malt, it can actually be very, very smooth. What I mean by that is that it tends to have less of the higher notes in it. And that's one of the fundamental difference of modern Scottish and Irish whisky. But originally, what's really interesting is that single distillation and then a second distillation was the common roots of Irish and Scottish whisky. So they had common roots, and indeed things like Paddy's and compared to Johnny Walker's, where they goes back to when blends were more popular than single malts. So single malts are a relative modern thing in Ireland and in Scotland. So if you look back to the roots of it, the roots are very common. They go back to the monastic orders. The monastic orders wouldn't recognise triple distilling and double distilling as we have them now, because they didn't do it that way. And the copper stills were a lot smaller. That's the other thing. So small batch distilling was much more common. So the modern distilleries that we're used to, particularly the ones with the pipes inside them, they're not as usual. Now, so I think the next part of the question, what's the difference with bourbon? Now, bourbon, my understanding, bourbon distillation, the most important thing is they always go into fresh barrels, and they don't, whereas Scotch whisky, when we barrel whisky, particularly for malts, they go into used barrels. And what I mean is that we can get sherry cask barrels. We use bourbon barrels. They don't have to be new barrels as such. So if you drink a bourbon, you get more woody notes. And that's just the reality of it, because the barrel is fresh. What was the last one? About Japanese whiskey, was it?
It is, yeah, Centauri.
Right. I'm going to say I actually like Suntory. Suntory whiskey. They don't have to do exactly what Scotch whisky do, because the Scotch whisky regulations are about Scotch. It's the same with bourbon regulations. So they can barrel their whiskies in barrels as long as they're producing it in a similar way. And I believe the Suntory whisky is barreled in a very similar way to Scotch. My own view on it is it's very close to Speyside, to my mind. They haven't produced any what I would call a high note peaty whiskies. So Suntory, very similar to what I would call Speyside, probably getting on to what being a sort of that kind of level of purity. I hope that answered the question. So it's not when you talk about Scotch whisky, I think we've got probably more variety, but I could be wrong. I'm not a big expert on all of Japanese whiskies.
I think you've actually covered it very fully, Bob. So perhaps along the same line, when and how did the art of whisky distilling find its way to the shores of Scotland? It's rumoured that whisky distilling came out of Spain to Scotland with Catholic monks via Ireland before the 11th century, but this doesn't seem to be widely written up.
Right. There's just so everybody understands, the Irish records and the Scottish records, and I'm talking about historical records, a lot of them have gone missing over the years. And in one particular a shipment of documents, a large part of the Scottish historical record from around 1300 onward to about 1500 was lost. And that means that a lot of the stuff, like you see the Aberdeen University looking into the civic records now, that is as close as we get. It's the same with the Irish records. Unfortunately, parts of the Irish records were lost when there was the Irish Revolution, or the Irish Free State came into existence. That was down to the fire in and around. Believe that it was in the part of the Irish record was lost in the actual fire in one of the libraries there. When we talk about Scotch whisky coming via Ireland, that was unlikely. It was more likely to come via the Benedictine orders. The Benedictine orders, they started brandies in France, and they were actually the strongest in terms of the monastic orders in bringing distillation to Scotland and also to Ireland, to be fair. And I believe that's probably the truth of the matter. It's hard to say which came first, the whisky in Ireland or the whisky in Scotland. What we do know is the first record of somebody drinking whisky is from Ireland.
Okay, I've got one last question from me before I hand over to the audience in Singapore, where Sharon Tay will look after any questions that may be from the audience. And my question is, it's said that at the end of the 18th century, there was an illicit still under the church in the middle of Edinburgh City. Was this true? And is there any evidence of that still to this day?
In the 18th century in Edinburgh, Edinburgh was a coal-fired city or a peat-fired city, and there was lots and lots of illicit stills in Edinburgh. There's across Scotland at one point there was a reckoning there was 14,000 illicit stills in towns and cities, and what used to cover them up was the smoke from the coal and from the peat meant that the excise men couldn't actually see very clearly which houses were distilling. They could smell the smell of malt, but that wasn't unusual because of breweries. And yes, there was a distillery under what was called the Tron Church. Unfortunately, due to fire and damage during the last 100 years, most of what was the original Tron Church is lost. But there is a record that indeed, yes, there was an illicit still found in the basement of the Tron Gate Church in the middle of Edinburgh in the old town. But unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. You can visit the basements of the Tron Church, but you won't find any remnants of the still.
Well, that's a great pity. Now, look, Bob, for a moment, we'd like to cut over to our audience in Singapore just to see if they have any questions that they might like to ask before we move on to our closing slides and to allow everybody to get on with the dinner and the whiskey tasting. So could I ask our team just to cut to our Singapore audience to see if there are any remaining questions, and welcome Sharon Tay to the microphone.
I have a question regarding the bottling of whiskeys. Why do they use corks? They keep breaking, you know, if you keep them for a little long, they keep breaking. It's quite a mess. Why don't they use, you know, like something like a metal, why cork?
Well, the main reason for using cork is cork was a natural compound, and it's the cork actually allows the whiskey to stabilize. And what I mean by stabilize is that a bit like the wood in a barrel, cork being a natural substance can actually hold a small amount of the alcohol residual. And my understanding of it is that with the encapsulation, apart from being the more traditional way of doing it, is a way of ensuring that the product stays stable over a longer time. It's the same as wine that uses aged wine that uses cork. It allows the actual alcohol to stabilize via using the cork. It doesn't actually lose an awful lot of alcohol over a period because of the encapsulation. Although you've got to remember that most of the blends, and I will say this, most of the blends do not use corks. It's more to do with the fact that the older whiskies, it's a more natural process and it allows them to balance out. That's my understanding of it. It's purely historical. Could we use something else? I'm not sure, because most of the other products that could replace a breathable cork, unfortunately, are based on forms of plastic.
Yeah, Bob, just have a question about production. Has Scotland ever had difficulty in producing large amounts of barley for whatever reason? For example, pests, insects, or weather, or...
Yes, well, Scotland has had a number of things historically where barley, there's been poor barley crops. And yes, you did find that whiskey production would go up and down with the excess yield on barley, because it always went in a cycle of, it went from barley, firstly to beer, because obviously beer was the far more common drink, a working man's drink, and then distillation. The one advantage that whiskey has, going backwards, and this is what going back to these 1,400 illegal stills, because they were only illegal once the law was passed that you had to do a license. People used to make whiskey because beer would go off, whereas if you distilled, you had a product that would be stable. But yes, Scotland did have barley issues. It has had barley issues. and also during the war, whisky production was curtailed because of the shortage of cereals in the UK. So if you get any whisky made anywhere around the war period, they're unusual because the actual rationing of cereals lasted a couple to 3 years. I think nearly up to 1950, some of the cereals were still getting rationed because of the war. So the answer is that yes, we've had problems, and so sometimes the whisky production is not so much now, but in historical periods going back via 1960s, yes, there was issues.
Bob, I think we have time for one last question from the audience, if anybody is out there, and then we'll move on to just start to wrap things up.
When does a PT whiskey gets the PT smell, and how does it develop the PT smell? At what stage of the process? At the malting time? When does it get the PT smell?
The malting, when you malt with peat, that's when you pick up the peat flavors. So it's actually is malting. And I believe the Islay, there's still a malting on Islay that does the traditional floor malting, which is unusual. But that's down to the fact that it makes sense because effectively they're cutting the peat there. So rather than having to transfer the peat to one of the other malting sites, they continue to malt on a very small scale, I have to say, on the islands. But you pick up the flavour from the effectively the smoking of the malt, basically.
Okay, so look, we've come to the end of Bob's presentation, and thank you very much for doing that, Bob. If we've not been able to answer all of your questions, or you've thought of some in the meantime, we do apologise. Now, in the meantime, a big thank you must go to the organisers, along with Bob, Archie Gracie, who's in the room tonight in Singapore, and of course our valued Singapore participants and those of you who have joined us online. So it's really been a pleasure to be with you this evening. And a small toast in Celtic, lang may your lum reek, which long may your chimneys smoke. So a toast to you all. Please do consider joining APAVM. If you've enjoyed the lecture and have not already joined APAVM, why not take a moment to click the QR code in front of you and take a moment to sign up to this amazing organisation. APAVM needs your involvement and direct financial support, probably more than ever, to keep the many previously planned activities that they have moving forward. It's also important to mention the upcoming APAVM Malta, Rome and Vatican trip that will take place in 2023 between 28th of April and 7th May. This tour will be one of the best yet, and for many participants, a first time to visit the historically significant island of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean. So we have come to the end, everybody. So until we meet again, allow us to wish you a joyous and happy Christmas and a happy New Year. And may the good Lord watch over you all and keep you safe. Now allow me to hand you over to Sharon Tay to continue what I know will be a most enjoyable evening for you all if you happen to be in Singapore. So thank you very much, and I'll be signing off.